This week, I decided to watch a good movie rather than some random old movie that I found in someone's basement or a back alley. I actually did watch a couple random movies as well, but for the review, I want to focus on something that you've maybe heard of. The movie is Master and Commander, The Far Side of the World. You've probably heard of this. So why do I even bother talking about it? Well, I'll tell you. And of course, I'll tell you why I think it's a great movie. This came out in 2003, directed by Peter Weir, stars Russell Crowe, Paul Bettany, and big ensemble cast, a bunch of other people. It was nominated for 10 Academy Awards, but it only won 2. A certain other film that year won 11. That's The Lord of the Rings, Return of the King. Looking back, it's kind of interesting to see that a fantasy film had such recognition from the Academy and not just technical awards. Personally, I think Master and Commander is better, but it's been a long time since I've actually seen The Lord of the Rings. I don't want to make that the frame for this video. This isn't a comparison. Who cares which is better? The reason why I want to do a video about Master and Commander, even though it's relatively well known and has been widely reviewed, is because I think it has something for everyone. And I don't feature a lot of movies like that. There aren't too many movies like that, but I'm a big fan of them when they come around. It might seem like I'm really only into strange movies that most people would fall asleep to, but this isn't true. Of course, this isn't about me, but I think there is a bit of an underlying dynamic here. Fundamental uncertainty running through a community of people who really like movies about what exactly the best movie is. Is the best movie the movie you watch after watching every other movie? Is it the movie that the guru on the mountaintop tells you about that only the chosen few can understand? Or is the best movie the movie that everyone has seen and everybody loves? Maybe it's some mix in between. Who knows? The truth is, it's a waste of time to try and figure this out. Everyone's on their own journey. And as long as you're following that journey towards movies that are more and more interesting to you, you're doing fine. The movies that I feature on this channel, those are the ones that come up in my journey, and most of them are esoteric. But there are also plenty of movies that have something for everyone, and it's worth talking about them and trying to get them as widely seen as possible, I think. My go-to example for this is actually The Truman Show, which is a funny movie, has action in it, it has a moral, and it's also a surprisingly incisive perspective on postmodernism. Great movie all around, which was, of course, also directed by Peter Weir. This movie, Master and Commander, it's eye-opening, it's intense, it has some funny moments, it has moving moments. It's set in 1805, so it doesn't have an incisive postmodern critique, but it does have some profound ideas about leadership, friendship, uncertainty. We'll talk about these things. Before we get into it, I wondered, before I saw this, why there's a subtitle, Master and Commander, The Far Side of the World. That sounds, these days, you'd think that's maybe a sequel, right? It's the third Master and Commander movie or something like that. The reason there's a subtitle is because this is based on a book series, books written by Patrick O'Brian, fairly well known. And this movie is roughly based on the 10th book. It's really a composite of a couple of different books. Some people, I think, are a little bit upset by certain facts of the adaptation, things that are a little bit different. Having not read the book, I actually think that some of the choices that were made were extremely wise, leading out some complications that really aren't needed in the movie. But if you're a big fan, there might be a couple of things you'd be annoyed by. The literary heritage of this movie really shows through. It's a literary movie, episodic, with unexpected dramas that come to the front and then sort of slide away, just like they do in real life. Maybe that doesn't make any sense, but it's literary. Maybe you know what that means. And yeah, some people will probably be bored in this movie, although it has big action scenes. It's a war movie, you know. It's got great special effects. It's literary. It has portions that aren't action-packed. It has portions that are intimate. It's probably why I like the movie, but perhaps it's not truly for everybody. But, you know, I'm doing my best here. Let's go back and step through some of these things in more detail. So, an eye-opening movie. It isn't clear to me how they made this movie. This movie's set on a ship. Pretty much the entire movie takes place on the water. There are big storms, big battles, hugely tactile film, tons of details, but also an intense film, going through these big storms, having these cannons tear through the hull and such. I honestly think that some of the special effects in this movie have stood the test of time better than the ones in The Lord of the Rings. With Lord of the Rings, we mainly assume, well, a lot of CGI, and for some of it, you can really see that it's CGI. And I guess that was cool in some ways, but like I said, I think some of this holds up better. I don't want to compare them, but there's just a number of times in this movie where I thought, man, how the heck did they make this? The answer is, it was expensive. The production is eye-opening, but the film is also intellectually kind of eye-opening, right? It's eye-opening to see how disconnected the sailors are, kind of out there on their own. You get your orders as the captain of one of these tall ships. You head out into the ocean, and it's good luck. sail around in the middle of nowhere. Maybe you run into an enemy, something to do. Hard to communicate back. Incredibly disconnected, your own little world, your own slice of England in this case. It's eye-opening to see how young some of the sailors are, some of the officers. I think this is factual. There'd be young men, boys, out on some of these ships, having to take up huge responsibilities, having to really step up to the plate. Eye-opening. This movie opens with a tall ship on the edge of a cloud bank, on the edge of a bunch of fog, and an officer looking through a telescope. He thinks he might see something through the fog, but he can't tell. And we actually get to see his point of view. We see the view through the telescope, and it's hard to tell. But it's clear that this is important. There could be an enemy just behind the fog, but the officer doesn't know. We're not sure. If you've seen any of my videos, you probably know that uncertainty is one of my favorite things in film. Why is that? Probably because uncertainty is just such a big part of life, but it's also an elusive part of life. I mean, it never quite looks the same, right? This movie opens with uncertainty and has uncertainty throughout, which is somewhat uncommon for films with a lot of action in them. Cinematic action is also often really highly stylized. In other words, it looks cool. And there are big snafus. There's suspenseful moments. So in some ways, there is uncertainty in action films because there's suspense, but that's not what I mean. I don't mean suspense. That's temporary. Uncertainty is a dramatic device, dramatic irony, something like that. To me, uncertainty is a little bit deeper. To some extent, looking through this telescope in the beginning, this is simple dramatic irony, maybe. Because not too long afterwards, we learn that there is a ship lurking, and we get a big battle scene. In some ways, it is just simple suspense, but one of the crucial things is that this tension doesn't paint the officer as heroic. He isn't martyred by the drama of the war. In fact, he shrivels in the face of it. He's paralyzed. That's why I think it's one of the really an example of sort of true uncertainty, really not knowing what to do, not whether you should trust your senses. The first officer, he never does anything really. It's actually the second in command that calls for the captain. The captain comes to the bridge, and at the time it seems like it might be a false alarm. The first officer, whoever, can't give him a straight answer about what he saw. And here we actually come to one of the second big things in the film, which is the complexity of the main characters and how this film shows leadership. In a lot of historical films, leaders become speeches. They become larger than life. Here we see a lot of little things, charismatic moments, genuine moments, real judgments, mistakes, uncertainty. This reminds me a little bit of the All or Nothing series on Amazon. This is a series of documentaries that go behind the scenes at major soccer clubs in Europe, Manchester City and Tottenham Hotspur. I think they're doing Arsenal right now. They're filming it, which should be interesting. We see managers and coaches a lot as fans. We see them in press conferences and interviews, and we get a certain view of them. We hear stories about them, and of course they're talked about as great leaders, as inspirational figures, as incredibly intelligent, but it's never very clear what they're actually like and what they do. Some people, I think, just assume that they're really tough and demanding. That's a lot of youth coaches are sort of tough. And so we assume, well, the pros must be just even more tough or something like that. But the reality is far more complicated. And I think one of the things that makes these shows popular is we get to see what these legendary figures are really like. I think people are really interested in that. And so there's something kind of similar with the military, too. People assume that generals are tough. And I guess they probably are, but they're not one-dimensional. And people are interested in seeing what it's really like. For instance, the Jocko Willink is a former Navy SEAL who has a podcast. And for the most part, he's extremely macho, but he also has moments of empathy and intelligence that take you by surprise, that show him as being not one-dimensional, seemingly peeling back, taking us from these larger-than-life portraits of legendary leadership or something, and showing us the real person. I wouldn't recommend this podcast, but I think it's an example. I think really this is one of the things that we're intrigued by when we study history. How can we make things three-dimensional? What a thrill for something to come off the page and be three-dimensional. Extremely interesting. It's one of the main virtues of this movie. There are big production values, but there's also intimacy, Interestingly, the film seems to make its own comment on this, actually. There's a great scene with some of the officers eating dinner together. It's an interesting scene. One of the younger officers wants Aubrey, that's the captain, Russell Crowe's character, Aubrey, Jack Aubrey, I think, to talk about meeting Nelson. Aubrey looks at him and he says, "I'll never forget the first thing that Nelson said to him. Pass the salt." Something like that. Turns out it's a joke. Aubrey makes a joke out of what the kid thinks might be a transformational moment. It wasn't this big over-the-top moment meeting Nelson. Aubrey goes on to talk about how much he respects him, to say how he's the peak of inspiration. But the story he tells about him is something that's extremely human. You know? It seems like the film itself is a little bit aware of the human element of all these things. Later in the dinner, the captain tells a joke. He makes a pun. It seems really lifelike. It's a tough balance to make historical characters intuitive to modern audiences. You want them to seem old, historical, but you also want them to seem familiar. Most movies get this wrong. This one nails it. Captain Aubrey is an interesting character. He's a good leader, but he's on the edge a few times. He isn't above it all. The main dynamic here is that you wonder if he's becoming too focused on his mission and overlooking the morale, the health of the crew, the men. But there are also a lot of little moments, like at one point they go and restock the ship in Brazil. There's a dinghy that pulls up alongside the ship, and in it there is a woman. This is the only woman in the movie. Jack sees this woman, the captain sees this woman, and it's possible he hasn't seen a woman in years. And it gives him real pause. It seems to call in question everything he'd put on a proud face a few moments ago to tell the crew that they're pushing on. They're not going to stay in Brazil. They're just going to quickly get supplies and push onwards. Completely committed to that. But seeing this woman, it seems like for a moment it might all slip, like he might reverse. It seems truly conflicted. The captain is only part of this movie. The other part is the doctor. In 1805, there was a big difference between the educated upper class and laborers. Today, you walk down the street, you wouldn't necessarily be able to tell the difference between a doctor and a construction worker. You bump into them on the weekend or something like that. Maybe there'd be some differences, but at the end of the day, everyone's going home and watching the same television shows, you know? Not like it was 200 years ago when, by looking at people's teeth, you would be very easily able to know quite a bit about their standing in society. The doctor in this movie is practically an alien walking among the crew. Even among the other officers, he's out of place. He's not a fighter. He's not particularly macho. He likes plants and animals as opposed to shooting people and getting wet. Maturin, this is the doctor, seems to only have one real friend. Master and Commander is based on the books from the Aubrey Maturin series. That's what it's called. Aubrey's the captain, Maturin is the doctor. So this is a central idea, this complex friendship they have. They play music together is one example. There's a cello and a violin that they play from time to time. I think this is accurate for there to have been instruments aboard this sort of a ship and for the few educated people there to play them. The playing in this film is a little bit miraculous. Russell Crowe and Paul Bettany put in a lot of time to really committed to selling the effect of playing instruments. You know, playing music in a movie is there's a lot of movies get this wrong. You've without a doubt seen an actor sit down at the piano and then we get a cutaway right as the music starts, and it's fairly obvious that we're seeing somebody else's hands. This is a classic. We've learned to accept it for the most part. But there are some movies where they do a lot better. The one that always comes to mind for me, by the way, is Running on Empty with River Phoenix playing the piano. Phenomenal movie, and that's a movie that really sells the music in it. Russell Crowe, Paul Bettany, they put in a lot of time, but the music ends up sounding probably way too good for the circumstances. The music does form a really nice part of the score. The sound design in this movie is great overall, by the way. It has a kind of an acoustic feel that also really captures the intensity of the ocean and of cannon fire and such. I think this was maybe mastered with theater sound systems in mind. It's a very dynamic sound. It might not translate that well to laptop speakers. The main idea of the music, presumably, playing together. I mean, look, it's representing their friendship. These two people, who are not far from the same, have a beautiful way to come together. Maturin and Aubrey, the doctor, captain, get along pretty well, but there are tensions. The main one is that as the captain gets more and more obsessed with the mission of the ship, the Doctor pushes back. It causes tension in their relationship. This is straightforward storytelling. The thing that I think is more interesting and what stood out to me was the little details. When this tension starts to ratchet up, the Doctor behaves a little bit worse in some ways. He starts being a little bit more aloof. He pulls away a little bit. He's not quite as engaged. He misbehaves just a little bit. And in this slightly guilty manner that we have when we know we're not quite being as reasonable as we could be. I do have some nitpicks about this movie. This movie's rated PG-13. Sometimes I'm a little on the fence about movies that are rated PG-13. It's not to say that movies are better if they're more violent or anything, but sometimes it really shows that a film has been sort of toned down so that it can be marketed to a more general audience. And this is generally not the kind of thing I'm interested in. This movie's rated PG-13, but it's a real intense PG-13. There's some scenes of medical procedures at sea that are enough to make you a bit queasy, even without seeing much at all. And so perhaps it would have been intolerable were it to be rated R, but I think there are a couple places where it maybe pulls the punches a little bit. There's a couple other things. For the most part, there's a good balance of sort of nautical authenticity with accessibility. You don't have to know how to sail to watch this movie and to appreciate it. I think if you did know how to sail, this movie wouldn't get on your nerves too much. It seems legit. But this isn't flawless. There's a thing early on where the captain keeps referring to this thing called the wind gauge. And at one point, someone says, "Remind me again, what's the wind gauge?" And he says, "Oh, it's like having the weather for us." And this line, to me, was one of the few misfires in the script where it seems like at one of the writers' meetings or something, some producer was very concerned that people weren't going to know what the wind gauge was in the audience. And you stick this sort of hokey, clarifying question in the middle of it. It didn't sit right with me. I mean, if you do have a real problem with the wind gauge, why not just change the line so it says he had the weather with him? That would work fine. For the most part, though, they get the balance really, really right with the technical side of things, but also the accessibility. Not perfect, though. Another thing is the final fight scene in this film. I wasn't a big fan of it. It's a bit hard to follow, which is probably intentional, filmed handheld and such. The captain is a bit of a Superman. It's not bad, but it wasn't my favorite. One other thing that's a little bit interesting about this movie is this kind of goes to some extent back to the accessibility thing in some ways, is that at times it's a little bit hard to know if some of the tactics that the captain uses are normal things for people have done at the time or if they're really extraordinary. He has a few tricks up his sleeves that he pulls, and it's hard to know if these are real Hollywood kinds of tricks or if it's something that was sort of standard practice and very common. And that's just hard to get around that. Most people aren't going to know much about the context of the time. But it does wear on you a little bit, maybe. That's, I think, all I can do to complain about this movie in general. It surprised me by how great it is. And like I said, I really think it has something for everyone. There's a great scene towards the beginning. After the initial battle, a lot of sailors are licking their wounds. But before long, we get back to everyday life. This is signaled by the captain and the doctor playing music. The sailors starting to mend the ship with the music in the background. It's a powerful scene, although it's fairly subtle. We see in the front of the ship 2 sailors fixing up the figurehead that was damaged in battle. And in some ways, this doesn't make much sense. What's the point of the figurehead? I mean, especially for these hardened sailors, this salty naval crew, you wouldn't think they would care much at all about ornamentation, about these superficial things. But in fact, it's one of the first things they fix up. Interesting. There's a lot more I could cover about this movie. Things about the role of the naturalist, right? The naturalist, what an interesting character. A gentleman scientist, once a huge figure in science. A very particular figure of the Enlightenment with a particular footprint in media. We won't get into that for now, I guess. This film also has a lot of sort of religious and spiritual ideas. I mean, I just hinted at these ideas of the figurehead, or the idea of the naturalist, right? The spirituality of the sea, and then some sort of Enlightenment ideals in some ways. The captain and the doctor are sort of represent these 2 poles. Interesting contrast, spirituality and nautical. Science, or the science of war, or the spirituality of war, and the science of nature. A lot of different ways to look at it. There's also an interesting geopolitical perspective. Like I said, these people are out in the middle of nowhere, extremely isolated. War under the microscope, huge geopolitical conflict coming down to somebody looking through a telescope and being uncertain. Interesting perspective on duty and patriotism. And of course, all these things kind of run along this sort of masculine core of the film. This is a movie with basically entirely men in it, and perhaps there's a lot to say about that. Anyway, great movie. Like I said, something for everyone. Easy, I think, to enjoy this movie. Easy to enjoy the big battle scenes. Really compelling production. But also, if you sink your teeth into it, you could be talking about this film, Master and Commander, for quite a while. And that's my kind of thing, so I can't recommend it enough.